December 9, 2002. Eileen Wuornos walked into the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. She was 46 years old. She had spent over a decade on death row. She had killed 7 men. She declined a last meal. And when they asked for her final statement, she looked into the camera and said, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with a rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day, with Jesus June 6. Like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back." The world heard that statement and saw exactly what it wanted to see. A monster, unhinged, dangerous, exactly what they'd been told she was. Nobody asked what made her. Nobody asked what was done to her first. That's what this video is about. Eileen Carol Pittman was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. She never had a chance. That's not a dramatic statement. That's just the truth of what the record shows. Her mother, Diane, was 15 years old when Eileen was born. Her father, Leo Pittman, was already in jail. He would later be convicted of child sex crimes and die in prison. By the time Eileen was 4 years old, her mother had abandoned her and her brother Keith, leaving them with their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos. Eileen would spend the rest of her childhood believing her grandparents were her actual parents. She didn't learn the truth until she was older. The Wuornos home was not a safe place. Lori Wuornos was a violent alcoholic. Eileen later described being beaten regularly. She described sexual abuse at the hands of multiple people during her childhood, abuse that investigators and psychologists who later worked with her found credible and consistent. By the time she was 11 years old, she was reportedly engaging in sexual acts with neighborhood boys in exchange for food and cigarettes. Not because she was troubled, because she was hungry and had learned early that her body was the only currency she had. At 13, she was raped by a friend of her grandfather's. At 14, she was pregnant. The baby, a boy, was given up for adoption shortly after birth. Eileen had no say in the matter. Shortly after, her grandmother Britta died. Her grandfather, unwilling to care for her alone, declared her incorrigible and had her placed as a ward of the county. Eileen Wuornos was 15 years old, alone, and homeless. She survived the only way she knew how. The next 2 decades of Eileen's life were a long, grinding story of survival. She hitchhiked. She did sex work. She drifted from state to state, Michigan, Florida, Colorado, back again. She racked up a criminal record full of small charges, disorderly conduct, armed robbery, check fraud. Nothing that suggests a person on a path to mass violence. Everything that suggests a person trying to stay alive with no safety net and no support. She married once, briefly. A 69-year-old man named Lou Isfel who she met in Florida in 1976. She was 20. The marriage lasted less than 2 months before it was annulled, reportedly after Eileen assaulted him with his own cane. It was not a love story. She was arrested, released, arrested again. The system touched her life over and over and never once asked the right questions. And then in 1986, at a bar in Daytona Beach, she met Tyria Moore. Tyria was younger, quieter, steadier. The 2 women fell in love almost immediately. For the next 4 years, they were inseparable, traveling together, living together, building something that, by Eileen's own account, was the closest thing to a real life she had ever had. She adored Tyria, completely and without reservation. That love would eventually be used against her. But before that, Eileen was, for the first time in her life, somebody's person. Somebody who mattered to someone. She was not a monster in those years. She was a woman in love, trying to hold things together, surviving the same way she always had. And then the winter of 1989 arrived. Between November 1989 and November 1990, Eileen Wuornos killed 7 men in Florida. All were middle-aged. All were clients she had encountered while doing sex work along the state's highways. I want to be careful here, because this section requires holding 2 things at once. These were 7 human beings with families and lives. Their deaths were real and their loss was real. That matters, and it should be said plainly. And at the same time, the full story of what happened is more complicated than the way it was told at the time. Eileen always maintained that the first killing, Richard Mallory in November 1989, was self-defense. She said Mallory had picked her up, driven her to a remote location, and brutally assaulted her before she managed to get his gun and shoot him. At the time, investigators dismissed this claim. Mallory was painted as an ordinary victim. What investigators did not disclose to the jury, and what emerged only later, was that Richard Mallory had previously served 10 years in prison in Maryland for violent rape. That information was withheld. Whether Eileen's account of that first night is entirely accurate, we cannot know. But the fact that her primary defense, that she was assaulted first, was directly supported by Mallory's history, and that history was kept from the jury, is a fact that has never been adequately addressed. The subsequent killings are harder to explain as self-defense. Eileen herself gave inconsistent accounts over the years, sometimes claiming defense, sometimes saying she had decided to target men who hired sex workers. Her mental state deteriorated significantly over the course of her time on death row, making it increasingly difficult to assess what was true memory and what was something else entirely. What is true is this. Eileen Wuornos was a severely traumatized woman with untreated mental illness, no support, and a lifetime of violence done to her body by men who paid for access to it. That is context, not excuse. Context. The distinction matters. By late 1990, investigators had connected several of the murders and developed a composite sketch. In January 1991, Eileen was identified and arrested at a biker bar in Port Orange, Florida. Tyria Moore was brought in for questioning. And here is one of the most devastating parts of this story. Tyria, the woman Eileen loved more than anything, cooperated with police. In exchange for immunity, she agreed to make recorded phone calls to Eileen from a hotel room while investigators listened. Call after call, Tyria told Eileen she was scared, that she needed Eileen to confess, that she couldn't handle the pressure, that she was worried she would be implicated. Eileen, trying to protect the woman she loved, confessed. She told investigators she acted alone. She said Tyria knew nothing. She gave up everything to protect someone who had already made a deal to hand her over. The trial that followed was one of the most grotesque media circuses in Florida history. Before the verdict was even in, movie deals were being negotiated. Producers were descending on Daytona Beach. The detective who led the investigation sold his story. Eileen's former lawyer sold his. Everyone was getting paid. Everyone was getting famous. And Eileen Wuornos sat in a courtroom being called a man-hating predator while the jury never heard about Richard Mallory's rape conviction. She was found guilty, sentenced to death, 6 times over. Eileen spent over a decade on death row. Documentary filmmaker Nick Broomfield visited her multiple times during those years. What he found was a woman whose mental state had deteriorated severely, someone who was paranoid, disconnected, and who had largely lost touch with reality. Broomfield openly questioned whether Eileen was mentally competent to be executed, whether she truly understood what was happening to her. In 2001, Eileen made a decision to drop all remaining appeals and push for her execution to proceed. She told Broomfield, "I'm one who seriously hates human life and would kill again." Many took that as confirmation of everything they believed about her. Broomfield believed it was a statement of someone who had given up, someone who wanted it to be over. Someone who had been in a cage for a decade with untreated trauma and untreated mental illness and saw no reason to keep fighting. On December 9, 2002, Eileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. She was the 10th woman executed in the United States since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. Charlize Theron won the Academy Award for Best Actress for playing her in Monster the following year. The movie made millions. Eileen Wuornos made nothing. Was given nothing, had been given nothing her entire life. I want you to go back to the beginning of this story with me. Not 1989. Not the killings. A little girl in Michigan. 4 years old. Her mother walks out the door and doesn't come back. She grows up in a house where she is beaten and abused. She is assaulted as a child. She is pregnant at 14. She is homeless at 15. At every single one of those moments, every single one, there was an institution, a person, a system that could have intervened, that could have asked the right question, that could have offered something other than punishment or abandonment. None of them did. I'm not telling you Eileen Wuornos was innocent. I'm not telling you the men she killed deserved to die. I'm not asking you to make this simple. I'm asking you to look at the full picture, to ask the question that the media, the prosecutors, the true crime machine never really asked. What happens to a person when the world fails them completely, from the very beginning, and never stops? Eileen Wuornos is what happens. And until we're willing to ask that question seriously, about her and about the thousands of people moving through the same broken systems right now, we're going to keep making the same monsters and acting surprised when they appear. She deserved better, long before she ever deserved punishment. Drop in the comments, do you think Eileen Wuornos was a victim, a killer, or both? And do you think she received a fair trial?